Having done two videos before, one on the reliability of the Bible as a whole and one on the reliability of the Old Testament, I'd like to turn my focus in this video specifically at the reliability of the New Testament. So the first thing I'm going to do is share with you an introductory video.
Have any of the original manuscripts of the Bible. The originals are lost. We don't know when, and we don't know by whom. What we have are copies of copies. In some instances, the copies we have are 20th generation copies. C.J. Werleman, Jesus Lied, page 41. In today's world, the integrity of the Bible is in question. People used to ask, is it true? But now they ask, is that what the Bible really said? What I want to do now is give you reasons for confidence in the Scriptures. So, do we still have the original manuscripts of the New Testament? In short, no, we do not. These original manuscripts, all written on fragile papyri, the ancient world's paper, were handed over and over again to scribes who copied them all the way up until perhaps the end of the 2nd century, so many times that the papyri would have worn out. Now, this may sound alarming, but it doesn't make the Bible untrustworthy. If we want to understand New Testament reliability, there are 4 questions that we need to ask. The first question to think about is, how many textual variants are there? Well, there's about 140,000 words in the Greek New Testament. And the best estimate today is that there's 500,000 textual variants, or a little over 3.5 variants per word in the Greek New Testament. Now, these numbers seem astronomical when considering these ancient manuscripts, but let's talk about 2 key factors: quantity and time. The reason that we have a lot of textual variants is because we have a lot of manuscripts. Consider other ancient authors. The average classical Greek writer has less than 15 copies of his works still in existence. And if you were to stack them up, they would be no more than about 4 feet high. And the earliest copies of their works typically date more than half a millennium after they were written. Consider now the New Testament manuscripts. The earliest manuscripts are only decades from the originals. And if you were to stack every copy of every New Testament manuscript that we have on top of each other, it would be more than 1.25 miles high. So if we're going to be skeptical about the New Testament, and we were to apply that same skepticism to other ancient Greco-Roman literature, we would just be plunged right back into the Dark Ages. What we really have is an embarrassment of riches when it comes to the New Testament text. Question 2. What kinds of variants are there? Of the 500,000 or so variants that we have, more than 99% of them make no difference at all. If a word is spelled incorrectly, that counts as a variant. But there were no dictionaries in the ancient world, and words would be spelled in a variety of ways, even by the same author, many times. Word order also in Greek is a matter of emphasis rather than a matter of meaning, like it is in English, because Greek is a highly inflected language. So you can change the word order without changing the meaning. What we need to focus on are the 1/5 of 1% textual variants that actually affect things. This group is both meaningful and viable. That's what I mean by the 1/5 of 1%. They affect the meaning, and they have a possibility of going back to the original. For example, in Mark chapter 9, Jesus is telling his disciples why they couldn't cast out a particular demon. He says this kind can only come out by prayer. Other manuscripts we have found finish the verse by adding the phrase, and fasting. This variant has implications on Christian practice, but not on doctrine. It's important, but it's not that important. Question 3. What theological beliefs depend on textually suspect passages? When examining the deity of Christ, we understand that the Bible claims that Jesus is God. But Dan Brown argues in the Da Vinci Code that this belief originated from Emperor Constantine at the Council of Nicaea in AD 325. Well, let's look at the evidence. The papyrus known as P66, which is a manuscript of John's Gospel and dated almost 150 years prior to the Council of Nicaea, clears this issue off the table with its affirmation of Jesus' deity in chapter 1. In fact, there's not a single manuscript in any language written at any time that denies the deity of Christ in John 1:1. Well, that's the deity of Christ. What about some other Christian beliefs? What about his virgin birth? What about the resurrection? Was Jesus really raised from the dead? Does the New Testament actually affirm that? And here's the thing I want to say, that even though some manuscripts may not affirm those doctrines in every single place, we have no manuscript that has any credibility to it that denies any essential Christian belief. And finally, question 4. Is the Bible that we have today what they wrote then? In all particulars, we don't know. It's probably not identical. But in all essentials, yes. What we have today in all essentials is the very Word of God. No essential Christian belief is jeopardized by any viable variant.
So let's look at some particulars in follow-up to Professor Wallace. So there are 3 primary tests for reliability of ancient texts. There's the bibliographical test, internal evidence test, and the external evidence test. So let's look at those 3. As far as the bibliographical test, what is that? Well, that's the test of transmission. Was the original manuscript, the original writing, accurately transmitted down through the ages, really for us, to the Bible that we can buy at the bookstore, the Bible that we have in our hands? Do we have a reliable text of what was originally written? So what is what's called manuscript evidence? You heard Dr. Wallace refer to manuscripts and the fact that we have an abundance of them. In fact, there are close to 25,000 manuscript copies of at least portions of the New Testament and over 5,000 whole copies of the New Testament. And he mentioned, some comparisons, and I'm going to show you a chart in a minute. But the bottom line is that we have more manuscript evidence for the New Testament by far than any other work of antiquity, any other piece of ancient literature. So here is the chart, and looking at some of these you may be familiar with. The first one is certainly well known, the Iliad, written by Homer, written around 800 BC, but the earliest copy that we have of that is from about 400 years later. We also have about 600 and almost 650 copies, which is actually a lot for an ancient document, so that we could sort of lay them side by side and see how they compare. And obviously, the more consistency that you have, the greater confidence you can have that you have what was originally written down. Plato, another one that you would be familiar with, written about 400 BC. Earliest copy we have is 1,300 years after its original writing, and we only have 7 copies. And yet, it is considered, those who study such things and departments of classical literature at universities would look at this and say that, yeah, indeed, we do have reliable copies of Plato, and it should be considered so. But if you skip down to the bottom, look at the New Testament, you can see that the gap between the original writings and when we have our earliest manuscripts is not nearly what we see in the other ancient documents. And the fact is that we have well over 5,000 full copies that we can lay, again, side by side, see how they compare. And again, the more copies that you have and the more consistency that you have, obviously, the greater your confidence that you can reconstruct, what the original said. So does it pass the test? Well, the bottom line is, and Professor Wallace referred to this, the fact that there is really not a single foundational doctrine that rests or depends on what is considered to be a disputed reading, because the variants that do occur amongst those 5,000 or so manuscripts and the 25,000, including those that we have portions. None of those variants change, the meaning. They are spelling, punctuation, things like that, so that there really is no disputed passage or doctrine. The writings of the early church fathers who quoted the New Testament writers, we basically have enough citations from the early church fathers' writings that you could literally reconstruct the New Testament just from their citations, even if we didn't have all these manuscripts. But if you combine the early church fathers' citations with the manuscript evidence, the evidence is overwhelming, in fact, that we do have a reliable transmission of those original documents to the Bibles we hold in our hands today. So let's look at the internal evidence. Here is what's called the Aristotle dictum. The benefit of the doubt is to be given to the document itself, not arrogated by the critic to himself, which is unfortunately what happens far too often, especially nowadays, where we run into what you could call chronological snobbery. Some scholar 2,000 years later saying they, that they know better, who actually wrote some of these documents or when they were written and so forth, when in fact we have, evidence of writings of witnesses and students of the apostles and so forth that were quoting them very, very early on. And obviously gives us a much better idea because they're much closer to when they were written. They are primary sources or secondary sources, and much more reliable than anybody who would be living today. And the other thing to keep in mind is that unsolved problems don't necessarily equate to errors. Just because there are questions doesn't mean that there are errors. Because over a period of years, what we have seen, obviously, is that there have been a number of objections that have been raised that have been fully resolved over time as we dig up more ground in the Middle East and discover more documents, etc. Arguments have raged about the dating of the New Testament in terms of when those letters, books, gospels, etc. were written. And why that is important is because obviously the closer to the actual events that the documents began to become written, the more reliable you would think, at least, that they would be. And in fact, skeptics have tried to place the writing of the New Testament documents into the 2nd century, creating a gap of 100 years or more from when the events occurred to when the accounts were being written. One of the reasons they may do that is because that passage of time they think allows for the building up of exaggeration and legend and so forth. But if in fact the documents were written very soon after the events actually occurred, and while there were still witnesses alive, whether they be friend or foe, that could dispute the facts, that's very, very important. And indeed, based on fragments that we've had writings again of the early church fathers who were already quoting the New Testament only a few years afterwards, and other types of scholarship, we can be more and more and more comfortable that the dating of the documents, in fact, could be very early. And one of the things that leads us to that is the fact that we know that the fall of Jerusalem occurred in 70 AD. So that if we know that the fall of Jerusalem occurred in 70 AD, and yet it's not mentioned in any New Testament book, it strongly suggests that most, if not all, of the New Testament was written prior to that. In other words, it's not mentioned because it hadn't happened yet when the documents were written. We also know that Paul and Peter, for that matter, were both martyred, were both killed under the reign of Nero when the persecutions from the Emperor Nero broke out after the burning of Rome, and he blamed the Christians. And that occurred around 64 AD. Therefore, their deaths were sometime shortly after that. Well, the death of Peter and Paul is not mentioned again anywhere in the New Testament. Most particularly, it's not mentioned in the book of Acts, which is properly named the Acts of the Apostles, written by Luke, which is again confirmed by early church fathers. Luke was a companion of Paul's and actually went on some of the missionary journeys. Luke writes extensively about the travels of Paul, and yet he doesn't mention Paul's execution. Why not? Because it hadn't happened yet. So Luke had written Acts before Paul was executed somewhere, let's say 65 AD. So Acts predates that. And we know that the Gospel of Luke predates Acts. So again, we're probably looking somewhere in the late 50s, maybe the early 60s at most. Again, at a time when witnesses, both pro and con, friendly and hostile, would have been alive who could have disputed if Luke had gotten his facts wrong. Here's a quote from a very, very well-known archaeologist, William F. Albright. We can already say emphatically that there is no longer any solid basis for dating any book of the New Testament after about AD 80. 2 full generations before the date between 130 and 150 given by the more radical New Testament critics of today. He goes on, in my opinion, every book of the New Testament was written by a baptized Jew between the 40s and 80s of the first century AD, probably, very probably, sometime between 50 and 75 AD. Again, within a couple of decades of the events that actually are being written about. Therefore, the use of primary sources, meaning eyewitnesses, can be assured. And finally, let's look at the external evidence test, because we can look at sources that are outside the New Testament, writers other than the New Testament writers. First and second century Christian sources, early church fathers, as I've mentioned, refer to the New Testament in terms of naming events, people, places, etc. Just a few examples. Eusebius confirms that Mark, John Mark, is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark, and that what he was doing was basically recording the remembrances of Peter. You could actually subtitle Mark as the Gospel according to Peter. Papias is one who confirms that Matthew is the one who authored the Gospel according to Matthew. Shouldn't be shocking, but there are those who question that. Irenaeus confirms again, repeatedly, the primary authorship of the New Testament, who wrote what, etc. And then there are others, Clement, Ignatius, Polycarp, Tatian, etc. There are many, many others. But there are also non-Christian sources, and here's a list of 9 of them who write about whether it's Jesus and or the events around that time that are spoken of or written of in the New Testament. And again, these are non-Christian sources. Well, what do they confirm? They speak of a Jesus of Nazareth, that this was an individual who lived a wise and virtuous life according to these non-Christian sources, that he was indeed crucified in Palestine under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Emperor Tiberius Caesar, that this occurred over the Passover time, and that he was considered, at least by some, to be the king of the Jews, confirming again things that were written by New Testament writers. He was believed by his disciples to have been raised from the dead 3 days later. This was not a legend that built up over a period of centuries or decades or whatever, that they were proclaiming this right away as confirmed by non-Christian sources. Even his enemies, again, in non-Christian sources, are confirming that he purportedly performed what they would term unusual feats or sorcery, what we would call obviously miracles. That there was this his band of followers, which were called disciples, disciple meaning learner, spread rapidly, even as far as Rome, from Jerusalem spreading all the way through to Rome, and of course spread in other areas as well. But they were confirming that even in Rome, that the band of disciples had spread. That these disciples denied the polytheism, which of course was prominent in the Roman Empire, that they sought to live very, very moral lives, and they worshiped this Jesus as Christ or Messiah or anointed one of God, and as a divine figure. So this was not a legend that built up over centuries, but right away they were seeing him as a divine figure. We also have archaeological finds, again, external sources we're looking at. The Dead Sea Scrolls have added vital evidence, even though they don't have New Testament fragments in those scrolls. They make reference to people from the New Testament that confirms, obviously, their historicity. We have archaeology that has authenticated a great deal of what Luke wrote. Again, Luke went about to, as he says in his own words, to very carefully examine the events so that he could write an orderly account. And so with respect to the things that can be checked factually, he was very, very careful relative to his accuracy. And it would only have been possible if he was alive at the time that these events were happening. That kind of accuracy requires proximity. And Luke had that. So the New Testament accurately reflects the conditions that was occurring, between 30 some AD and 70 some AD, when the events happened and the accounts were all written and so forth. And this is known by things that we continue to find. For example, that the Romans regularly did hold an enrollment and a census. In fact, approximately at least every 14 years, and that it was common practice to make people return to their home of origin for the census, for the roll taking. That there is mention, we see mention of a man named Quirinius as being governor of Syria. Again, Quirinius is mentioned in the Gospel of Luke in connection to the tax that drives Joseph and Mary to Bethlehem. That in fact he was governor twice, 7 BC and again 6 AD, approximately 20 years later. There are many, many ancient cities mentioned by Luke in the book of Acts. You can see here 32 countries, 54 cities, 9 islands, and of course every single one that he mentions, he does so accurately, again, indicating his proximity geographically and chronologically to the events that he's describing. We have evidence of crucifixion. We've actually found bones with Roman nails through them, which kind of confirms the act of crucifixion, how it was done. Bones of also of legs having been broken, just as was described in the Bible with the 2 thieves on the cross, which was done to hasten death. We have evidence of confirming that the Romans indeed did seal the graves as was described in the New Testament, and there was a great punishment for disturbing that seal, and that there was very, very harsh punishment to a Roman soldier for falling asleep on guard, which sort of disputes or contradicts the notion, that the Roman soldiers at the tomb of Jesus fell asleep allowing the disciples to steal the body. This kind of flies in the face of the evidence that we found. And Pontius Pilate, there for many, many years, it was disputed that there was ever a governor, anybody named Pontius Pilate. But of course, as is so often the case, archaeology found an inscription in stone in the area of Caesarea. It actually occurred as they were building the Aswan Dam and the water levels were changing and so forth. And they found an inscription that described this Pontius Pilate. And in fact, he was governor of Judea at the time of the crucifixion. We have found ossuaries of bones from the time period with crosses on them, confirming obviously the notion at least of the crucifixion, and including prayers to Jesus for help. And why is that important? Because again, they're praying to him because they see him as a divine figure. So very, very, very early on, his believers were praying to him and seeing him as a divine figure, the Son of God. This was not a legend that built up and was exaggerated and begun 100 years later when all the witnesses had died. They have found the court where Jesus was tried by Pontius Pilate, the pool of Bethesda, which is mentioned, of course, with the healings, the corroboration of individuals mentioned by Paul, discovery of coins that are mentioned in the New Testament. Again, just kind of providing foundational accuracy and trust in the reliability. It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. For Acts, the book of Acts, the confirmation of historicity is overwhelming. Any attempt to reject its basic historicity must now appear absurd. Roman historians have long taken it for granted. That is the accuracy of Acts written by Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke, a very orderly chronological account of the life and times and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. More by William F. Albright. The excessive skepticism shown toward the Bible by important historical schools of the 18th and 19th centuries, certain phases of which still appear periodically, has been progressively discredited. Discovery after discovery has established the accuracy of innumerable details and has brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history, accurate recording. The excessive skepticism of many liberal theologians stems not from a careful evaluation of the available data, but from an enormous predisposition against the supernatural. By having a starting point that I will not believe in the supernatural, you arrive at your conclusion before you even examine the evidence, because a fair examination of the evidence, as we have seen and as you're hearing from these scholars, a fair examination of the evidence leads one to the conclusion that the New Testament is accurate in what it reports. I'd like to share with you one more video. This is William Lane Craig, another scholar, and he's going to be answering, you're going to hear him answer a question from a skeptic.
Hi, Dr. Craig.
Hi.
I'd like to follow up on the previous lady's question. It seemed to me like most of your evidence for proving your 4 facts was predicated on Scripture itself. It seemed like there was very little cross-referencing, as you suggested in your answer to her question. So my question is, why is it that we take the New Testament to be of such validity and
To be what?
to be so valid? Why do we take it to be valid? And wait, 1 second. And at the same time, not fully believe that, say, the stories in the Odyssey occurred in reality, or that other great Greek fictions were also real? What separates the New Testament
Well,
from
in a
those?
sense, the lecture this evening is the answer to your question. The lecture this evening is an explanation of why most scholars today think that the story, for example, of the discovery of the empty tomb is historical, or why Joseph of Arimathea is taken to be the person who buried Jesus. I mean, think of the burial account of Jesus. I am in no way, as I said, privileging the New Testament. We're looking at all of the ancient sources for Jesus, but what we have in the case of the burial is...
What sources support this story besides the New Testament?
Why do you ask that question?
Because
you see,
I feel like...
that question betrays the assumption that the sources in the New Testament are somehow suspect and are not to be taken as evidence. But if something's outside the New Testament, now that's real evidence.
Oh, I
and
apologize. I'll clarify.
Now that's question begging, because what I'm saying is that you look at all of the sources that we have for the life of Jesus equally, and that in the case of the Gospels, these are the earliest and most primitive sources that we have for the life of Jesus. And so to ignore them in favor of extra-biblical sources would be simply mad as historical methodology. The historian always will look at the earliest, most primitive documents as his most reliable documents. And what I tried to show this evening is that these facts are, for example, take the burial, multiply independently attested in early documents. And this is one of the most important criteria that historians use for establishing a fact of ancient history.
Right, which brings me to my question, right? What other sources attest to this burial story?
In the case of the burial account, there's something like 5 different sources, independent sources, some of which are among the earliest of the New Testament. I mentioned 2 in my talk tonight. This pre-Pauline formula that Paul quotes in his first letter to the church in Corinth, Greece, is information that comes from...
Shouldn't the letters from the apostles also be taken with a grain of salt in that case? It just seems to me like the validity, the truth of the resurrection is dependent on the truth of Scripture, and the truth of Scripture is dependent on...
No, you have not shaken loose yourself from the presupposition that this is somehow an inspired document and that you believe in it because it's inspired. That's not the way critical historical Jesus scholars work. And it's not a matter of the fact that Paul says it. As I say, what's critical here is that Paul is quoting from a pre-Pauline tradition that goes back to within the first 5 years after the crucifixion. This is a source which is incredibly close to the original events, which Paul himself used, quotes, and passes on. So it has nothing to do with Paul. He's just the intermediary who passed on this tradition. Similarly with the pre-Mark and Passion story. Mark may have been written in the early 60s, but the pre-Mark and Passion story goes back even earlier than that. Many scholars will date it around AD 40 or so. That's just 10 years after the death of Jesus. Now, you compare that with sources for, say, the life of Alexander the Great, where the earliest sources or earliest biographies we have of Alexander are written by Arrian and Plutarch 400 years after the death of Alexander. And yet they're still regarded by classical historians as largely reliable accounts of his death. The sources that we have for the life of Jesus are just incredibly close to the events that they are about, and therefore they are taken extremely seriously by historians today. And you can't write them off because hundreds of years later, the church collected these documents, put them under one cover, and called it the New Testament, right? I mean, originally there wasn't any such thing as the New Testament. There were just all these separate documents written in the Greek language, like Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, Paul's letter to the church in Thessalonica, Luke's gospel of the life of Jesus, John's gospel of the life of Jesus. All of these various documents were then later collected and put under one cover called the New Testament. And therefore, it's just bad historical methodology to say, oh, that's in the New Testament, therefore, this isn't an important historical source or isn't a valuable historical source. That's just treating it anachronistically. You got to treat these documents for what they originally were and then look at or apply the criteria for historicity to the documents with a view toward determining what is reliable in them and what is unreliable and can be ignored or discarded.
So let's take a look at a conclusion here. So as was said previously, and when we looked at the chart, you may recall, if one is going to discard the Bible as being unreliable, then at the same time, you need to discard really virtually all literature of antiquity, because we have so much more evidence that the Bible, and in particular the New Testament, that we have reliable transmission down through the ages, and it's to the extent that, as you could see in some of the quotes that I provided, that it's absurd, to think or believe that we don't have an accurate transmission of the Bible today. So in fact, we can hold the scriptures, the Bible that we can get at the bookstore and so forth, the Bible that we have in our homes, that it is trustworthy and historically reliable, and in particular when it comes to the New Testament. So I hope that this has helped in terms of maybe teaching you something you didn't know before, and provided you with a foundation of trust. That when you, in this case, when you open the New Testament, that you can believe that what you are reading is in fact what has been transmitted down to us down through the ages. So thanks for watching, and may God bless you.